Asterisks, welcome back to another episode of Aster. For those that are just turning in, Aster is the youth-led podcast of the literary magazine Aster Lit, which focuses on cross-cultural connections within the writing world. I'm your host, Zara Hafeez Siddiqui, the podcast director and a managing editor at Aster Lit, and I want to give all of you and our wonderful guests a heartfelt welcome to episode 30, Connection Between Arts, the Presence of Storytelling Everywhere. Now, let's get to know our wonderful guests. Could you guys please give a brief introduction of yourselves and your role at Aster Lit?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Hi, everyone. I'm Emma. I am a co-editor-in-chief and president of Aster Lit. I mainly write poetry and creative nonfiction, and outside of writing, I also enjoy mathematical biology, philosophy, and a lot of other concepts.
Hi everyone, I'm Tony and I am a managing editor at Aster Lit. I like to write poetry and I do a lot of street photography, and outside the arts, I really like political science and reading about global affairs.
All right, that's wonderful. So, since the topic of our episode is the presence of storytelling everywhere, and since Tony is someone who really enjoys photography, I think my question that should start this entire thing off should be, what do you guys think photography is? How do you perceive it?
Okay, I can go first. I think photography to me is important as a means to storytelling. And I think just taking photos is very powerful, and you can focus on creating through your lens, and you're able to tell stories visually. And recently I've been just focusing on like creating series of works instead of just creating individual photos. So that really is pushing me to focus on intentionality as well as having like a clear message in mind as to like what I'm trying to photograph and like the story I'm trying to tell.
Yeah, for me, similarly as well. I think an interesting distinction between literature and photography is that, like, it's almost like literature has to go through another layer of thinking. Like, people like go throughout the world, they see things, they hear things, but then you have to transcribe it to language. You have to think about, like, what about this, like, thing that I'm seeing sticks out to me the most? Is it the colors, the feeling? How do I put that into language? And how do I make that flow in terms of like the sentence structure and the syntax and the rhythm the language has? It feels like you're kind of like almost like painting with words a scene that you see. But in photography, like you directly see something and you can just directly take a photo. It's almost like it's like your second pair of eyes, except you just have a way of capturing what you see. But at the same time, with playing with like light and camera settings, there's also ways to like change kind of what you see and use that, and what Tony was talking about with like intentionality, like really intentionally focus on seeing the world a certain way and capturing that. So I think it's really cool because in writing, it's like, how am I going to like distill the worlds or like transform it in a way from one medium to the next, whereas like in photography it's like, how do I want to see and capture the seeing differently? At
Also,
least
I think oftentimes, yeah, that's wonderful. Also, oftentimes I find myself just like looking at a certain thing and I'm like, that would look so good as a photo, and I just want to just take a picture of it and just keep it. And many times you take photos and they end are the things that end up inspiring you to write even. So I think that's like a layer to photography. It just helps evoke so much inside of a person and just brings forth a lot of a lot of thinking of many times. You can look at a photo of an old man and wonder what his life has been like, and you can just make out the entirety of his life in your own head and just create what you want out of it. And I think that's quite beautiful as well.
yeah, I think it's like, I feel like I was also talking about this in my part, but in general, like, how do you think like the act of thinking in terms of literature versus photography differ from each other? And like, what like stories do you think like the written word or the spoken word tells better? Or has a different like flavor on, as opposed to photography, and like how do you think they coexist? Or like, I don't know, I just kind of want your thought processes and like what makes like the written word, whereas what makes like a photo.
I think that is like it has many layers to it because if something is written, oftentimes it is written in a manner that subjects us to a certain way of thinking, right? And we have a certain perspective on it because it's what it was supposed to mean. But I think the difference between these two is that for photography has like a certain ambiguity to it because you can just oftentimes you can just think of anything when you look at a photo and it could be correct. You don't have to necessarily have a certain perspective on it. It can be just many different things and they could all be correct. I think that is what I see it as.
Yeah, I agree. I think to add on, I think spoken word especially is interesting because you're able to hear the poem through like the author's words and how the author is speaking the words as well as like the tone, the pace. So you're able to gain, I guess, another layer of insight into like what the author really was trying to achieve with the poem, for example. But I think, like Zara said, with photographs, you don't really know what like the author was thinking if you don't have like a brief caption from the author describing what is happening. So it is a lot more subjective in my opinion, and I think that opens the door to wider interpretations. And like Zara said, the viewer is able to really shape the photograph in a way or bend the photograph in a way to fit, for example, something that has happened to them and really put like their experiences into that photograph. So I feel like for me, that creates another layer of connection.
Do you think then, like in a way, is a photo closer to the truth than literature because it's not like as biased?
So yeah.
I think that's interesting. Like something you said earlier, with photography, it's like you're able to change the way things are. So I feel like not exactly everything is as is. And also I think there's a big difference between like street photography compared to like something like studio photography where you're able to like control everything from like the lighting to the backdrop. So I feel like in street photography, for example, like the canvas is the world around you. So you are subject to like what is actually happening around you. You can't really control it. So I think that also adds element of like surprise. So I wouldn't say it's like more realistic. I would say it's like um I think both has its advantages.
But I also think that you did mention biasness. I think that even in photography, when a person views it, it might not be from the author's perspective, but from your own perspective. You could, so I don't think it's like, now that I think about it more, I don't think that it's the immediate truth because every person will view it differently and every person will view it in a way that will fit their circumstances better. As in to, for example, if a person feels guilty about looking at a photo, then they feel guilty. But if a person feels happy looking at a photo, then they feel happy. Neither of these are immediate truths because there is no immediate truth with a photo. It just can have multiple meanings. So I think that that also transpired the fact that a lot of people will view those things as a little bit more biased to themselves instead of, just, yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially in a lot of like really historically like important photos.
Yeah.
Like I'm thinking about like lunch atop a skyscraper, like after taking a push, like AP United History, and like learning a lot more about what America was like 100 years ago. It like the photo gives me such a deeper sense of like the American dream and like the hardships of these like immigrant workers to build up what we now see as like the grandeur of New York. Or that one famous photo, I forgot what it's called, but of the Great Depression, of like that one mother um after like learning about the actual effects of the Great Depression,
Oh yeah.
that photo differently too. And like the same with like The Falling Man by Richard Drew, like knowing about how crazy and like significant 9/11 was to American history, not only in terms of like policy, like political aspects, but also just in like the whole spirit of America, how they all came together and how that really shaped our like foreign policy for like the years to come. I think that definitely like having the historical context or the like situational context behind any photo really changes the way I see a photo. So I get what you mean, like by like with any piece of art, I feel like there's no like objective truth or there's no objective way to interpret it because every person who interprets it like um sees a different like point of view of the art. And even if you see the photo like once today and you see it tomorrow, the experiences that you had from today and tomorrow like influence the way you see a photo or read a story.
Very interesting idea, like context. Do you guys think like a photo by itself could stand without like much context from a series of photos? And also, do you guys think like adding words to a series would help contextualize the photos and better let the viewers, for example, understand what the author is trying to get?
I definitely think so. When we were talking about the whole like how we view a photo is based on what we know, like I'm just kind of thinking about how like before we were also kind of thinking about how I said that like a photo was universal because not everyone speaks the same language, but everyone like lives in the world, and when they see like a like starving child, for example, and like the vulture and the little girl about the famine in Sudan, like they definitely see that and they feel for the girl. But I think like that assumes that we all kind of have the same like ideas about the world. We have like the same ideas of like poverty. We know a country's like relative wealth or poverty and like in comparison to our own and in comparison to the global context. And while there are things that we think is common sense, like a lot of people like definitely would be a little confused if someone says like they don't know about slavery or the Civil Rights Act or something. Like they're having a similar level of context to a story, like to a photo, definitely um makes it a lot more meaningful and striking because you can't really always assume that everyone has the same knowledge or context. And it kind of just levels the playing field and like narrows the ways people can think about a photo to closer align it to the photographer's intent.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with Emma's perspective on the entire thing. It's just like it depends on how much context a person has and how much they have thought about certain things and how much they feel about certain things. Because uh for example, the photo that Emma mentioned, the vulture and the little girl, it's about the famine in Sudan, but the people who don't know the context of it might not feel as much for it as other people. So I do think that sometimes certain things requires a certain bit of context. Like once again, another piece that Emma mentioned, The Falling Man by Richard Drew. I think that the photo, when I first looked at it, I did not know the context behind it. But when Emma told us about the context behind it, now that I look at it again, I feel quite differently. So I do think that certain times, certain photographs, if they want to be looked at and perceived with as much delight as the photographer hopes that they are, then I think they would require a certain bit of context to have that amount of, importance to them as the person who created those photos wants it to have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just adding on really quick. I like literally also didn't know that vultures eat like the remains of things. So when I first looked at the photo, I was just like, oh, why is there a vulture? Why do they kind of look the same? But then like upon like remembering that vultures like devour the remains of like, for example, a dead animal, it's like the vulture is waiting for the girl to die because the vulture knows the girl is like about to die. And that just adds another layer of tension that I think not knowing that definitely wouldn't have. And that's just like, I think if someone didn't see that and that was pointed out via text, that would really, really change how they saw that one photo.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's very important. Like personally, I didn't know that, so I feel like just Emma saying that, I feel like my perspective has already changed. But also, I was thinking about on the flip side, right? I feel like a lot of authors as well as photographers have this approach where they voluntarily leave a lot of space or leave a lot of shadows for authors or for viewers to interpret. So how do you guys for example, when you create works of literature or create photographs, how do you guys balance the mindset of going into it saying like, oh, I want to clearly shape this message, I want to give a lot of context, versus when you guys want to provide a lot of for example, ambiguity as well as, I guess, negative space for your viewers or for your readers to interpret.
I have a thought on this actually. This reminds me of this discussion I was having with Fiona, another editor-in-chief, about the convention to like how we should put foreign language in like English pieces. For example, a lot of pieces have like a certain word in like Mandarin Chinese or in like Korean, and that feels closer to like the vibe of the piece of dialogue, for example, because it's actually in the language. But then there's the question of should we italicize it? Does that make it so it's not part of the actual like English, um, the like status quo, what we see as like the normal way it's supposed to be like read? Or do we provide a translation? But like providing a translation also means that we are adapting it for an English audience. Or do we want the people to chase after the translation themselves? If they really care, is it their responsibility to uncover the context? And I think making that choice or not making that choice, like very much changes the flavor of the piece as like the piece of writing as much as it would a piece of like a photography. Like if you see like for example the vulture and the little girl, because we were talking about that before, like you obviously know something like crazy is happening. Like there's like a girl should not be starved to that extent. But like is it up to the author to tell you exactly about the crisis, or is it up to you to research it, to be shocked into the action of researching it? When you read a poem, like is it part of the author's message to tell you exactly what every foreign language word represents? Because even though they decided to include the foreign language, they care about comprehensibility more than like preserving the like full on viewing it as a foreign like word. Or do they want you to feel a little bit misadjusted and try to dig up that like distance between like because you know that if it's in a foreign language and in English, there is kind of some distance and like the difficulties of communicating and the like tensions between the two languages. And Pupe Masagi, I don't know if it's we also interviewed her for the social impact of the writer, and her translating House One, she write aligns all the text to mirror the discomfort like people who speak Farsi feel when they read left aligned English text. Like, is that part of the message? And I think like this is a kind of really long ramble, but I just think that these choices kind of mean a lot in terms of what the actual message of the photo or of the piece of literature is as well. What do you think about the same point, Tony? Like, do you think that, how do you think like adding context to a photo or to literature changes the meaning? And
I think you brought up a really great point, like the translation, especially like you said earlier, also, languages are not universal. You cannot just assume like everyone speaks the language that you're able to speak. So I feel like there is kind of this barrier, but also that barrier really pushes people to kind of like do their own research as like the viewer. I feel like there's also this burden for them to kind of go out and really get to know this for example, new words in another language to really understand like a piece that is for example describing something new or like a different culture. And I feel like that is really interesting and also translates a lot into photography because just recently I've been really focusing on like the impacts of shadows as well as like very like high contrast photography. So it was very interesting to see like the balance between um following like conventions in photography, like leading lines and hard shadows, and comparing that with like storytelling. For example, just referencing like Bruce Gilden, for example. Um, I think some of his photos are very, very powerful. Like the photo we mentioned earlier, comparing it to like the vulture and the little girl. A lot of his photos were focused on the struggles of the 1900s, the struggles of the Great Depression, and it involved a lot with using flash photography at a very close distance with the subject, and it exposed a lot of I guess gruesome scenes, but I feel like those scenes were really important in conveying the message of the author and really exposing like the difficulties that people went through and experienced with drug addiction. So I feel like balancing storytelling with um, aesthetics is also something that is challenging but also beautiful in itself. What do you think, Emma?
Yeah, I think very similarly, I'm also looking at some of Bruce Gilden's works right now, and that also made me think about how we were talking about if truth was more explicit in photography, and we were talking about how like no, because bias is whatever, but just like knowing that a photographer, like a photo actually existed when it was being taken, like changes the truth element so much more. Like just looking at these photos, like when you see like something crazy in literature, you know that it probably was it had to do with the real world, but maybe it was changed in the perspective of the author from like the real world to putting it into language. But just seeing the photo like speak for itself, you know that this exists in the world and this was just merely captured. This is true somewhere for someone. And I think that just like hits a lot more. And that's why I think that like that's why a lot of times like literature is more like it it kind of like has its own context because it's already like interpreted, but because photography is just so in your face, it just really grips you and like maybe that will lead to more context that will lead to like you reading the context later or that leads to you like searching up the context, but like it's kind of like there's two layers. And first you see the image and then you think about the context. Whereas in literature, a lot of times the context is embedded in the writing.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Like you said, like photography is a lot of the times very up in your face, even if the subject is not like directly really close to the camera. So that really like brings me to the question, like I guess in the arts, especially with visual storytelling, a lot of times I think the goal is to leave like an impact on the reader, no matter how that impact is felt. Some people might take it as um something that reminds them of another event that happened, reminds them of trauma, reminds them of happiness. So in the end, important do you think these, I guess, guidelines or rules that the world has set out for like the arts, how important do you think creatives need to like follow these rules? And do you think as long as we're able to leave like an impact on the reader, then the storyteller's like mission, I guess, is complete?
Yeah, I think like obviously what makes an impact is partially the way it deviates from what we expect. like I think that's what impact is in general, like when there is a big change in something. Um, like I think in physics it's like change in momentum. It's been a while since I took physics one, but I really like resonated with the physics definition of change in momentum because it's like it's such a movement. Like I feel like there has to be some kind of motion that deviates from the norm or like how you normally perceive something. Like it twists your thinking in a different direction. And I don't know that much about like photography rules or whatever, but I think that in literature, like when there is a rule broken, such as when like poetry is written in a very strange form, it really draws attention to why it's written in that form, like what secret meaning can only be communicated through breaking those lines. And it almost feels like the message like it can't reside within the normal bounds of societal thinking anymore. Like we have to kind of break it in order to actually get at what the like piece is trying to say, which I think is really interesting. But also like another part of impact that I was thinking about when you were talking was like we were talking about how like photography is a lot more in your face. So do you think that like in a way because it's so in your face, like the impact ends up being a kind of like shock porn as opposed to like a more sustained kind of like change or impact? Like, do you think that photography is perhaps more like susceptible to like shock porn than literature? Or like, I don't know if that's like the right word. There might be a more technical word for it, but just like works that really capitalize on your emotions and almost in a way that feels not exactly generic, but it just like it feels like it's really taking advantage of that fact.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I feel like with literature though, equally, I think authors can leave like I guess like a shock factor impact. But with photography, I think there is definitely an aspect where you're able to leave like this shocking impact on the viewer. But also I feel like that's not necessarily with like all photographs, right? I feel like because we've referenced these historically famous works, including like The Vulture and the Little Girl, as well as works by like Bruce Gilden and a lot of these activists or photojournalists. I feel like we focused a lot on like these harsh, these strong impact as well as strong contrast photography, and which obviously are very like in your face and I guess encroaches a lot upon like your personal space in a way. But I feel like there are also photographs that, for example, are just of very calming scenes like near the lake or on a very sunny afternoon or of a sunset. And I feel like those photographs can also have a very subtle and very, I guess, like beautiful impact. Just makes you think like the world is really beautiful after all, in contrast or in comparison to a lot of these like photos that were taken during I guess difficult times that convey like a message of activists. So I feel like there's two extremes to that end, and I feel like that's what really makes photography as well as literature very interesting because not all the time like you need photos that are very up in your face and photos that are very strong in contrast, but a lot of times it's about like also balancing and also recognizing a lot of the photos are not necessarily super like up in your face or the poems are not super focused on like the issue that is going on in the world. And a lot of times these poems or these photos of just quote unquote like generic things or these I guess beautiful things in the world can also be very powerful and resonate with the viewer or the reader strongly as well. And in that sense, I guess it also leaves a strong impact, at least for me.
Yeah, when you were talking about that, I was looking at some of Van Ho's works that you are showing us, and I really, really admire like the ambiguity and how like normal but also like surreal a lot of his images are. They kind of remind me of like like almost as if like if Edward Hopper was like from a different culture or something. Like I really like all the mist and it like feels like letting out a breath and like seeing like your breath in the air like in winter or something. And that is really, really beautiful. And in a way, I think that's like what literary fiction is in comparison to journalism. And also, I think that your like thoughts on like light and contrast are really cool because in photography, like part of what creates the shock factor is contrast. Um, but also in like Funho's like more gentler works, there is also a lot of light and contrast. So like I guess how do you see like contrast and like the role of contrast in photography and how did that affects like storytelling in general?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I think, like you said, like contrast is very important from just a technical standpoint in photography. And usually, I guess it's practice where photographers in post-production raise the contrast, and that really made me think. And I feel like that's very interesting because it kind of has become habit at this point to like be used to just raising contracts in photos that are just straight out of the camera. And that really made me think um like you said earlier, like does photography really portray reality? And in that sense, I feel like somewhat because photographers are also able to like manipulate a lot of the photos in post-production and how we are so used to just raising contrasts um made me think about how I guess the world as is might be flat or might be not as appealing to the eye. And I feel like manipulating those factors really is an interesting thing and also kind of an ethical thing. I feel like from a pure like ethical perspective, is it ethical to really like make huge adjustments to your photographs or is like adding contrast a part of the process and like as production, post-production actually just like a part of the process. I guess you can compare it to like revising a poem or um going through different drafts of a poem or of a piece. And I feel like there's a lot of also like ethical debate among using like technology, like artificial intelligence to remove, for example, like dust in your picture or to remove noise, like digital noise in your picture to enhance the overall like feel of the picture. So I think there's also a lot of like ethical concerns that we face, but in the end, I feel like just making that impact is super important and I guess a goal at least for myself as a photographer.
I think when Tony mentioned the ethics of it, I do want to point out that uh, I believe if the pure essence that comes from the photo is kept even after post-production, then I think that it is ethical in a manner because at the end of the day, you did compare it to revising a poem or revising a piece of writing. And I think that is how a post-production photography works too, because you're refining your work, you're making it a tad bit more better than what was originally created. But as long as the changes don't completely, I think, take away from what was originally captured, then I think that it should be fine because post-production is a part of the process of doing things. You're not going to, I don't think anyone would want to publish the first draft of the book they write, and I don't think anyone would want to give a speech before refining it. I think that is my standpoint on that.
I think that in writing a piece, like a poem, a book, a speech, a lot of times the only person whose like ideas you're trying to convey are your own. And I think in that perspective, it makes a lot of sense that you need to revise because you're thinking about how do I best convey what I want to convey. But when you're taking a photo, I feel like a lot of times it's a photo of like the world outside of you. It's a photo of someone else. It's a photo of maybe another culture, another period, another group of people that you're not as familiar with. And so in post-production, I think like it's kind of asking like you're making all these edits to the photo and you're refining it, but through whose lens are you refining it? You're refining it through your own, the photographer, the person that is capturing, and maybe not refining it through the lens of the captured. So I feel like a lot of times, like there's that one famous like example, I think, of the New York Times editing or cropping the pyramids to like fit their cover better or something. And that like they like changed the dimensions of the pyramids and there was like huge outrage and like the New York Times ended up like withdraw or I think it was actually not National Geographic. They ended up like withdrawing like the entire issue or whatever and like apologizing because of like they manipulated it to be a better cover, but it wasn't as true to the actual pyramids. And that wouldn't really like no one's gonna sue like you for like changing your own meaning of a poem because it's your own poem and you get to decide what your own emotions on like sunlight in New York City is in that poem. So I do feel like literature sometimes has more of a like direct author voice and that makes it kind of okay to edit, but sometimes like because photography is about the outside world, sometimes the ethical lines are like a bit harder because it's not like as controlled by the creator.
See, I do agree with that perspective because I did say that to a certain degree, you need to keep you can edit a photo to a certain degree to maybe make it a little bit more. I was more of talking about the lighting and the atmospheric abilities, not of the complete editing of a photo. So since you pointed out that they changed the dimensions for the pyramids and stuff to fit their cover better, that is something I do not agree with at all. I think that's where I think that's where it draws the line because you can edit things to a certain limit. And I think that certain limit is okay, but going beyond that is not, is my point of argument.
Yeah, but like in the studio, you're the photographer in the studio. So like who's defining that certain limit? Is it the subject? The subject might be like still on the street. Like it's you who's defining that limit. So in that point of view, I feel like it's kind of like one-sided that we get that the creator gets to decide the limit and not the person being photographed or not the like actual thing being photographed.
I think this could like also another thing that could stem from this is the conversation we had earlier. Everyone has a different perspective of viewing a photo, right? So maybe the person who's capturing it has a certain visual for it in mind that they want it to end up as, and they maybe they want to edit it in a way that could, you know, provide the person who is looking at it with a similar context as to what they see it as and as to what they want the end product to look. But this is like a very big debate on opinions, I think.
Yeah. I think also just another quick thing to point out, I do still feel like people expect photos to be closer to the truth than writing. Like because of the same like this had to have happened and then I took the photo. Like I was there and I took the photo. Whereas like literature, people know that people go through drafts. People know that like it's like the written word of the author. I think like it feels more like lying to edit a photo than to edit a piece of writing because it's more interpreted to be like this is the actual truth the way it is.
I think that would then end up falling into a person's moral category more than it would fall into the ethics of dealing with things because post-production is something that does happen often. And uh, certain things, yeah, they're not ethical, but then when you look at it from the perspective that Emma has provided, then I think it's just a moral battle of what you think is correct at the end of the day.
Yeah. I think Emma mentioned something cool is like that photography is working with like the world around you and you don't really get to decide like for example what is going on at what time and like what is happening around you, especially in like big cities. And that really makes me think like how photographers are able to use like creativity or like chase inspiration in a world that has already been, I guess, quote unquote, like predetermined compared to like literature. and where you're searching for inspiration, but you are like the author, so you get to really have a lot of freedom as to choosing like who are your subjects, what you're going to write about, and like where you're going to take your poem or where you're going to take your piece. So how do you guys go about like finding inspiration, I guess, in literature compared to like photography?
I think like they kind of complement each other really well, actually, now that you mention it. I think a lot of times because photography is in the real world, like you would just be seeing something, you'd be like, that looks really cool. Like I want to take a photo of that. And then that also like piques your interest in seeing the photo that you took, like knowing that like just like actually being conscious of your desire to capture also helps you like feel more inspired to write because it shows you what part of the world you care about aesthetically. But I think for me, like when I get inspiration to write something, it's like an emotional truth. But when I get inspiration for photography, it's more like a visual, like, whoa, and then that leads to the emotional truth.
I think that I mentioned this before, but a lot of the times, certain things that I end up writing end up stemming from things that I have seen or things that I was like, oh, this looks wonderful. I want to take a photo of it and I want to keep it with me. So I think that is like something that does happen quite a lot that you look at something, you take a picture of it, and then when you can't write anything and then you look back at that picture, it helps you write again. I think that happens what a lot more than it should, but it's like how much can I get from this picture? I remember an experience I had with this was I remember I had a writing slump and I had to complete an essay for school, and it was regarding how we perceive fire as an individual, right? And
Really
I was,
cool.
yeah, it was like we were supposed to write about how we perceive fire, and a lot of the times a lot of kids when it was like a group project and stuff, and everyone had their own essays, but some were like I perceive it as hell, and then some were like, oh, I perceive it as cooking food. And I was like, I really don't know what I perceive fire as because it's just something I never thought of. And then I came home and then I looked at this picture a friend of mine had taken, and it was this beautiful picture. The entire background of it was black, and there was a man sitting by a fire, and he was just like he was poking it with a stick and trying to make the flames bigger and stuff. And there was a post sign in the back and everything, and it was a lovely photo. And that made me realize that I think I perceive fire as that old man's life, and maybe it's something that can have multiple meanings. That was what, and I think if I did not come back home and if I did not had not seen that photo, I don't think I would have been able to get out of that reading slump and complete that essay, which I did get an A+ on, mind you.
Yay.
Guys have any experiences that ended up helping you look at a that through which in a photo you looked at a photo and you were like, oh, that just gives me so much ideas for what I could write regarding this.
I think like for me, because I read a lot of creative nonfiction, so looking at like old photos of myself or old photos of my life like really strikes a chord because like it's so easy to forget things, especially because like I think as we mature, we kind of start to look at things from a different like lens because we've seen more of the world and we are like more developed people. But like sometimes looking at a photo I took 5 years ago, it makes me actually see the world through the lens of like a 5-year-old me, like me 5 years ago, because I could like imagine myself taking this photo. Like I can imagine myself thinking like this is why I want to take this photo right now. This is why I think the scene is pretty. And maybe like me right now will not would not notice the same thing. So I think because like it's choosing what parts of what you see to preserve, like it also really shows like a whole different mindset of looking at the worlds.
Yeah, I think that's actually very interesting. Like you said, like uh, a picture that, for example, that you took 5 years ago might really portray like you 5 years ago, and you can't really change like the perspective that your camera takes a photo, but if you view an old photo yourself and your perspective has changed. So there's like this um juxtaposition of your perspective compared to like the perspective of the camera at the time that the photo was taken. So I thought that idea was really interesting, like your perspective on top of the perspective that the photo was taken from, and um how that really reminds you of like the past and how you're able to view it from a different perspective, but at the same time the perspective remains unchanged from the moment that you took the photo. So I thought like that was really interesting, and just the thought of like freezing the action at that moment, at that exact time in history, and thinking how that perspective of the camera would never change in the photo you took, but you as an individual could change perspective anytime you want. So I thought like that idea was really interesting. And it reminded me of how we like interact with the world around us. Like Emma said, like seeing scenes that might attract us now might not have been attractive, say like 10 years ago, 5 years ago. So how do you guys as like creatives go about seeing like the world around you? And do you think like being someone that creates works of literature and photograph pushes you to always be vigilant or always be mindful of like the surrounding around you?
Yeah, definitely. I think it happens a lot more now that I'm old enough to have like a phone of my own. It's an Asian family thing. You don't get it until you're like a certain age. But now that I have a phone of my own, I realize that it it happens it happens in the blink of an eye. I look at a thing and I'm like, this needs to be captured. This needs to be a photo and this needs to be kept. And I think that 5 years ago, the person I was definitely would not have had this kind of perspective on things, and they would not be like, oh, I want to take a picture of this. It's a random picture of a random pair of earrings put on a pedestal, and I want to take a picture of it. And if I were to put the Zara 5 years ago in front of that pedestal, she would be like, it's just a pedestal. You do not need to take a picture of it. But I think over time, the way of perceiving things definitely changes. People grow up, people's mindsets end up changing. And another experience was that I had a workshop, and in that workshop, they asked us to take out a picture we had taken 5 years ago. And all of us did that. There were five of us. And they went around asking each of us what we thought of that photo 5 years ago. And I distinctly remember I thought that it was like a cat, and it was kind of limping, but it was back then I thought that the cat was so adorable. And that was my perspective on it. But now, after 5 years, I think that that is the saddest picture I have looked at, because look at the poor cat limping. And it's just a completely different way of perceiving certain things. And you need to I think the art of photography is that you are able to capture something and you can keep changing your perspective on it for as long as you want.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that touches on a lot of things that we've been discussing. That's really cool. And I like the example. For me, I kind of have kind of a more negative experience. Well, I'll start with a good experience. Like I think like when I was really into writing poetry and like abstractifying everything I saw into words, like literally like light filtered through my eyes differently or something. Like I feel like time moved differently. I feel like sometimes like I would just be standing on a road for like 5 minutes just like staring at a lamp like for no reason, just because like I don't know, I was like thinking about how to make it into a poem or something. And that like when I look at the like photos I took at that time, they were very like imbued with like a poetic sense of like I almost could feel like the emotions that were on the tip of my tongue as I was like writing or taking that photo. But I think like lately, like taking photos have kind of been stressing me out because I realized that like I have the ability to capture what I see at a moment, and like I think I am. I'm like kind of a little bit of a control freak, and that like I take a photo, I look at it, and I'm like, oh my God, it's like not good enough. Like the angle needs to be better, blah blah blah. And I end up taking like 70 photos of like the exact same thing, and like moving like 2 feet, and then I have like somewhere to be in like 5 minutes. And it's just like I like really really want to like with like literature, I know I can always go back and I can always change things, I can always edit, but I'm only going to be at this one spot once with the same lighting once. So I feel this like immense pressure to capture exactly what I'm feeling and what I'm thinking because I really want to like look back on that. And then I just get really frustrated with myself. I'm like, okay, never mind. So I don't know, as like someone that takes a lot more photos than I do, Tony, like how do you feel like that like the like desire to like the perfectionism and like fully controlling and fully like knowing that you can distill an experience into a photo, but the like actual like hard part of actually doing that, how do you like deal with the like I don't know, feeling like you want to do something so badly and like I don't know, just the tensions within that.
Yeah, I think that's like so relatable. I feel like for me, I kind of have like this pressure for myself to like create good work, especially like I like to travel a lot and like during the summer, for example, last summer I went to Portugal. I went to Lisbon there, and I felt like I paid so much for the trip, and it's not like I'm going to go back in like a few years. So I feel like there was a lot of pressure to create like good work, and if I found like a really cool scene, I would definitely like slow down, even if I was like with my family, and they would like walk ahead, and they would be like, where are you? They would start calling me in like every 5 minutes because I would just be so behind because like through my eyes I see like a really cool scene or a scene that has a lot of potential, and I feel like that's a really good thing for me. At least I think working the scene is really important in photography, and just like maturing as a photographer, I feel like being able to work the scene is really powerful because just seeing potential in a photo is the first step, but you also have to be able to move a bit or change your focal range or change your aperture, for example, and kind of alter like the scene and see like how you can portray the image through a more unique lens. Because a lot of times it's just exactly like what Emma said, like it's kind of like perfectionism, but also not because you see the vision and you feel like you're like just right there, like you're super close to getting that quote unquote perfect image that you had in your head, but like you feel like you need more time to work the scene and see like if you can shoot the picture behind something or add something in the foreground to add layering, or also you have to wait for the perfect subject, which is something that's also kind of tedious in photography, but also a part of the beauty of photography, like waiting for the perfect subject. Like Emma said earlier, in photography, you can't really control like the world around you. Not like you can just create a subject out of nowhere, sorry. So you have to kind of wait for that subject to come in frame. And a lot of times you don't really know like if the subject is going to come like the moment you leave. So it's kind of like a waiting game, but also it gives you like excitement in the process.
Wait, that's really beautiful. I think that's really funny. Like you actually just wait there and you're like one day, like soon, like the perfect person for my shot will just show up next to this like cool like shot and like that seems like such a crazy process. It's like sitting at a train station waiting for like the love of your life to come or something. Like that's like I feel like that changes like that like I that like though also when you were talking about working the scene, I mean, I'm not completely sure what you mean by that still, but I like just like the changing everything and trying to find a like way to capture the scene that works best. I think that like is so different from writing because like with writing, like you can walk away with a certain emotional feeling and return to it. But with photography, like it's like you're trapped in the moment. It's like this like really weird like chase between you and the moment in the moment. So I think that like writing and photography definitely probably like shapes your brain in such different ways. And that was just really interesting to hear as someone that has more of the writing perspective and a little bit of the photography perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like waiting for the subject again, I think it's worth it because you don't see like quote unquote perfect scenes or perfect settings uh in the world around you like every day, and it's not something that happens like a lot, at least for me, to have like a super ideal situation with like the perfect lighting, for example, as well as the perfect setting, the good colors around you. So I feel like waiting for the subject is kind of like the final touch to the image, and a lot of times it's like playing like a surprise game. So um it's not like super tedious, but it does get tedious. And I feel like in the end, having more photos to choose from doesn't hurt and would be better than having like not enough photos to choose from. So I feel like waiting there really sets me in the mood and like prepares me to take like that perfect photo when the subject walks in. And that kind of forces you to also be like more intentional with your work and choosing like the good colors that complement each other as well as the perfect subject. And I feel like that's just like another aspect of the beauty in creating and just waiting for like the perfect subject to come in and kind of yielding your control to like the world around you is kind of like an interesting and also cool idea. Just not being able to control like what's going to happen next and just giving kind of your fate to like the world around you and seeing like what happens next, because in a place like New York City, I feel like so many things happen at once and like you never know what's going to happen next. Like you never know what's going to happen down the street from you, or you never know who's going to come in, who's going to say what. So I feel like it's really worth it, and you would really, really regret it if you had like this perfect scene and you just didn't wait that extra like 5 minutes or so to, or like even a minute at times in busy places to like get that perfect subject that really could like elevate the final touch on your image. So I feel like Emma said, like photography and literature combined really like changes your perspective, and they work in complement a lot of times. And one gives me inspiration for like the other.
I think another thing is that just as much as photography influences literature, I think photography itself is influenced by time because since we mentioned waiting for the subject, I think it's just a battle of time. Imagine like you have five, like Emma said, you have 5 minutes and you're trying to capture the perfect subject, but the subject just won't come in frame and you have to work with what you have left. I feel like that is one of the most stressful times when I'm taking a photo and I'm like, I don't have the time for this, but I need to do this. And it just does not end up happening the way I want it to happen. So I'm like, oh no, now what do I do? And then I just have to work with what I already have. And I just like make either something else the center of attention, the subject, or just like make the, or take a photo without a subject in general.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Also, just another point that we were talking about with the with the waiting for like the subject. Like I was like, does that ever happen in writing? Um, and I low-key feel like yes and no, because I kind of feel like for in a sense, like I was really into writing when I was like, well, I still am, but like I was really, really in the zone in like ninth grade. But then I was like, I feel like I don't have enough life experiences. I need to wait until the life experiences come so I can write about them. And now I have a lot of writing experience, like a lot of life experiences, but I've like changed my point of view so much that I don't know if I can like convert them into writing pieces. So I don't know. I think it's just interesting that like the dependence that both writing and literature has on life and how that's outside of our control, but our minds are in our control. But it's like really the interactions between our mind and our life. So it's like in our control, but also not in our control. But also, I low-key like believe in predeterminism, anyways. But like, anyways, anyways, um, I just think that this has been like such a pleasure to talk to you guys as well. And I think like the conversation, you also like the parts that you say and your perspectives in your control, but where it goes ultimately isn't. And I just think that's a pretty cool metaphor.
Yeah, and I think
yeah.
it made me realize that it really does show us how like us three different people have three completely different perspectives and things. And it just like it just narrows down what photography actually is, the different kinds of perspective. a person can have of one certain thing. I think that's a good way to conclude it then.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree. I think just like finalizing and wrapping up everything you guys said, I feel like in the end it really just shows like how little control we really have within like the world among us. So I feel like a lot of times it's just about like waiting for that perfect moment, even in like literature, and waiting for that like perfect life experience really means a lot. And it's a whole journey in itself, and it really takes like a lot of time. And um I don't think it's something to be rushed. And yeah, like Emma said, like I really enjoyed talking to all of you today.
It
Yeah.
was wonderful, and I'm really grateful that you guys took out the time to come up on the podcast and talk about this wonderful topic. It was genuinely so much fun, and I am really grateful. Is there anything you guys would like to say just at the end, just a final remark or something?
Like, I think both literature and photography are ways that we like through which we try to understand the world, just like science, just like philosophy, just like math, like all of these conceptual and art forms, like everything we kind of do is like a way to understand the world. And I think that's beautiful. And I'm glad that I was also able to share these perspectives with you guys and learn a lot more about the way your brains work and the ways you perceive the world.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's like a process to understand everything around you. And it's not necessarily like a solution or like a means to an end. It's like a process in itself. And like people say, like the most important part of creating is like the process and not like the result. But of course, the result's important too.
Yeah, definitely. Kind of ominous quote from me. Don't expect literature to save you. I suppose you could also say don't expect photography to save you. But yeah.
And I think that, but like, do sometimes it is fine to assume that the art that you make and the art that comes from you can save you, because there are times when it can, and there are times when looking at a lovely photo just makes your day so much better. And I think that's all right. Thank you
Yay.
guys so much.
Thank you.
Yay! Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Tony. I had a wonderful time with you guys on this episode 30, Connection Between Arts, the presence of storytelling everywhere has come to an end. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode. It couldn't have been possible without you guys and without Emma and Tony, of course. For more, follow us on Instagram at Asterlit, ASTER.LIT, and check out our website, asterlit.org. That is ASTERLIT.org, for transcripts and more. Keep your eyes open for the release of our next issue, issue 13, Reprise, and we will be seeing you guys soon. Thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you.